Hi, we're just about getting started. We're gonna give it 2 more minutes, but we are really excited to continue our series talking about gun and gun policy. And we're waiting for our special. Let's see. Okay, one more time. Oh, there he is. Wonderful.
Yeah.
Thank you so much, Denzel, for joining us.
No problem. I'm super excited for this too. So
Awesome. Great. Um, Well, I know we have like a minute before we're formally about to get started, but maybe we can do a little intro to the series. So, and a recap of yesterday. So, yesterday we talked with you and Tanea about responsible gun ownership and what that means, and a little bit of the history and the work that y'all do at the Middle Tennessee Black Gun Club. So that was really awesome. I know I learned a lot. I don't really know a ton about guns. Part of the reason I was really excited about this series. But yeah, so really excited to continue the conversation today, and also to preview for folks for tomorrow. We're going to have the incomparable, indescribable, amazing Brianna Perry, our executive director, who will moderate the discussion. So that's a real treat. Definitely everyone should tune in tomorrow. Um, and we're going to be talking more specifically about like the current gun policy debates and what that looks like. So really excited to get into that, especially ahead of the special session, which was really the motivation behind wanting to do a series like this, and us reaching out, and our collaboration is kind of the rhetoric we've been hearing and how that sometimes doesn't really align with our stated values. And so I'm really excited to get into that. But before we can even get into that, I am really excited today to talk about the historical context on kind of like, what kind of historical context do we need to know to really have these conversations in an educated way? What are the ways that we talked about? And I really appreciated what you said yesterday around that, like, everyone, if you're going to legislate something, if you're going to be, talking about these things, we really need to have an understanding of how firearms work and what the cultural context of these debates really is. So super excited to get into it today, and we'll get started. So it's 1 o'clock. I'd love to welcome Denzel Caldwell, Sergeant at Arms with the Middle Tennessee Black Gun Club, here today to talk about the historical context behind all of these debates, and kind of really get into it. So can you tell us a little bit more, just remind folks in case they weren't able to tune in yesterday, about yourself and about the Middle Tennessee Black Gun Club?
yeah. So peace, everyone. My name is Denzel Caldwell. Pronouns he, him, his. And as Nina said, I'm the Sergeant of Arms for the Middle Tennessee Black Gun Club. Just to give a little bit of a background about myself and in relation to the gun club, prior to Tanea and I and a few others founding the club, I have been a martial arts instructor for a very long time. And at a certain point, I recognized that we're in the 21st century and firearms are here. And so I wanted my students to have some idea of how to navigate, firearms. And so I slowly started to get into it, took a couple of classes, and then I was like, well, I might as well go be an instructor since I'm instructing like in other things. And so that eventually led me to Tanea. And from there, we've just been like partners in arms, for lack of better terms. And so, which led to the founding of the gun club. But the Middle Tennessee Black Gun Club is a club that is dedicated to educating Black communities, in particular in Middle Tennessee, about the importance of not only self-defense, but also safety in all aspects. So not, even beyond firearm safety and how to properly handle it. We also are talking about pushing and teaching the importance of life essential skills like we discussed yesterday, which includes things like CPR, AED, first aid, de-escalation, things that aren't necessarily associated with a gun, but could be applied in many other aspects. But with the firearm, we want people to be deeply knowledgeable, not only about how it works, the power that it has, no matter what firearm that you have, but also the laws around them, right? And in addition to that, which is kind of like based on our conversation today, we also stress the importance of understanding the histories, and I say histories because there are various histories around firearms, especially here in the United States. And so, yeah, I'm really excited to get into this conversation today.
Yeah, that's amazing. Thank you so much. So, kind of jumping into that,
Yeah.
multiple history, I'd love if you could share a little bit more about the history of like guns in the Black community and kind of how the Middle Tennessee Black Gun Club talks about those things and thinks about that and, you know, contributes to that history.
Yeah. Yeah, and I'll start off by saying that's a very, very large question, but I'm excited to try to tackle some of it today. So one of the things that we like that I want to ground our conversation in is that before we get started to the history, that the Middle Tennessee Black Gun Club actually does not identify as a Second Amendment organization. And I know that sounds weird because it's like, oh, you're a gun club in the Second Amendment, but we recognize, just in the spirit of today, that the Second Amendment was not made for Black people. Historically, it was actually used to suppress slave rebellions, any sort of foreign opposition at the founding of the American Empire, as well as other things such as labor uprisings and et cetera, et cetera. And so we start with that recognition that we are continuing the tradition of the Black Arms tradition. And so really, if we want to get into a conversation around Black people and firearms, we can't start in the United States. We have to start on the continent of Africa, particularly on the west and central coast. Guns were a major tool that were used to capture and enslave our ancestors and be forcibly kidnapped and brought over the Atlantic Ocean to the Americas. And not even before we were forced onto boats, we fought back, right? It's really as simple as that. Like whether we're talking about other means of fighting back outside of the firearm or utilizing the firearm, that was a part of that resistance, right? And when we landed here, despite popular narratives and sort of mainstream discourse around the suffering of African peoples who were enslaved in the Americas, there's a very rich and very complicated and long history of Africans resisting colonial oppression, right? I'm actually going to share a few texts today that people can explore if they're interested in going further. But one book that I got from my personal library is called The Black Rebellion, which are eyewitness accounts of major enslaved revolts. And it's written by Dr. Sujan Das. And so what this book basically does is it accounts for various African uprisings on the plantations. And one thing I like to note is that it's international, right? So we're not even just talking about the States. We're also talking about South America, Central America, as well as the Caribbean, especially like places such as Haiti, for example, which will be important in this conversation. So you have various rebellions, Stono Rebellion. You have things like the German Rebellion that I think was used as one of the artwork or was depicted in some artwork for this particular conversation. You have various uprisings that include people like Gabriel Prosser, conspiracies such as Denmark Vesey. You have various maroonages that existed in places like Florida, where certain African populations who ran away from certain pre-United States plantations would run to Spanish Florida to build relationships and communities and maroons with the indigenous in Florida as a form of resistance against English colonialism. And so there's that aspect of that history. And then once you get into the founding of the United States, which of course is very violent and imposed by the gun as much as, if not more, than some of the previous European nations. Then this is when you start to see some of the ones that you're more familiar with, right? So the Nat Turner rebellions. And actually, before I go into the Nat Turner rebellion, it's important to note that the uprisings of African peoples on plantations were not in a vacuum. Many of them inspired each other. So when we think about the Haitian Revolution, for example, which was a pivotal moment in this particular history because this is the first time you see a successful overthrow of a colonial power by formerly enslaved Africans and the founding of a Black Republic, right? And not only just a Black Republic, but a republic that was founded by the formerly enslaved, right? And so this reverberates throughout not only North America but South America in ways that that have heavily impacted history. So we wouldn't have the Louisiana Purchase if it weren't for this armed uprising in Haiti. So shout out to Louisiana and a lot of those states. And because of that, that inspired a lot of other African diasporic populations in the Americas, right? So Nat Turner, in many ways, had heard about the Haitian Revolution. Certain other groups, religious groups, such as the African Methodist Episcopal denomination, in part was founded by their founders being inspired by the Haitian Revolution and organizing around their particular denomination. You get other rebellions that are noteworthy, Demarvasi, and so many others that, in part, again, were deeply inspired by what happened in Haiti. So Haiti is really important and very much so a critical piece to understanding any sort of armed struggle within the United States and then also in the Americas, right? And so as we get another book, as we get closer and closer to what we call emancipation in the United States, and there's another text that I want to bring up, and it's called Force and Freedom, and it's called Black Abolitionists and the Politics of Violence. And this is written by Kelly Carter Jackson. And the reason I bring this up is because there were various tactics that were used by abolitionists at the time to combat the institution of chattel slavery, right? This included moral suasion, or, the idea of we're going to convince those who are supporters of chattel slavery to think otherwise, right? Through religious methods, through political arguments, et cetera, et cetera. Well, Black abolitionists were like, okay, let's see how that works. You had your white Northern abolitionists that were trying to engage in sort of political, quote unquote, civil debates. But then when you have things like the Fugitive Slave Act that come into play, and you see a more sort of a tighter grip placed on the plantation, particularly after Nat Turner's rebellion in the 1830s, this is when you start to see tensions really, really, really rise and really get even worse for Black people who are already in enslavement. And so one of the things that this book talks about in particular is how a lot of Black abolitionists were like, there's no room for moral suasion. We need to engage in literally fighting back using tools such as the firearm in order to push our white abolitionists in the North to be a lot more aggressive and arguably revolutionary in fighting chattel slavery. And so then, of course, this plays a huge role into things such as John Brown's raid on Harper's Ferry. You have people such as Harriet Tubman, who carries a firearm. Frederick Douglass carried a firearm and even talked about the importance of having that as he pursued emancipation, citizenship, and the ability to exercise the vote. And so then, of course, you get the Civil War, which is a war, right? A lot of Black folks fought in that. Um, and one and one thing I think that's really pivotal here in this long history is post Civil War. Um, Post Civil War, you not only get a country that is attempting to reconstruct itself following this really, really, really bloody war, but you also get people trying to figure out what is the direction of the nation. And that was a very violent period. The Reconstruction era was notably violent. So much so, I think it's important for us to think about that moment as we look at fascist violence now, and some of the things that are echoing that make us think of the Reconstruction era. So this was the era where you see a lot of former Confederates who were disgruntled by losing the war and being occupied by the Union, create small militias to attack black families, black individuals, black communities. And again, black people were not docile. We fought back. We fought back. And I don't say that in any uncertain terms. Some were former Union soldiers and said, hey, you know what? We're going to group up. We're going to continue to arm ourselves despite the black codes that explicitly disarm black people. And we're going to protect our communities from these former Confederates who are trying to attack. Then you get that violence that begins to organize itself, and you start to see organizations such as the Ku Klux Klan, which, by the way, was founded here in Pulaski, Tennessee. And so from there, going through the post-Civil War period, post-Reconstruction, so 1877 into the early 1900s, you get Jim Crow, and particularly 1877 through the early 1900s is what we consider the nadir period, or the lowest point in history. And the reason that is a particularly important term in this conversation as it relates to black people and terroristic violence, that is both state-backed and vigilante, I might add. This is where we experience one of the highest recorded amount of lynchings in this country, right? And so part of our response to that had been to organize in formal or informal groups within our communities to fight back. In so many ways, the rifle, the revolver has kept black communities from being wiped out in a genocidal manner, in no uncertain terms. A lot of times we can think of so many people who have who are notable in history or we've heard about in history that actually took a very clear position on firearms and the necessity of it in the struggle for a better world for black people, such as Ida B. Wells. You can actually find one of her quotes where she talks about that every black home should have a Winchester rifle in their home, particularly because she was making the point that with all of the lynchings that were occurring in the early 1900s and the state refusing to respond or supporting or co-signing those lynchings, black people had to protect themselves. And so this is when you start to see, again, formal and informal formations of black communities, whether they be gun clubs or informal groups, dedicating themselves to defending their communities. This, I want to say, is very important to know and to think through with other marginalized populations too. And one thing I particularly want to know are certain labor organizations, because one of the things that's not talked about in this country alongside these marginalized histories of armed defense are the militant labor armed defense. So this is also the time where you see a lot of unions that were a lot more internationalist, that were engaging in armed struggle against their employers, even against the state. I would encourage folks to look up things such as like the Battle of Blair Mountain, the largest labor uprising in U.S. history. But that's an aside. So getting through this timeline, we get to the Civil Rights Movement, the Civil Rights era, the early mid-1900s. This is when you start to see organizations such as the Deacons of Defense. These are black people in the South who, as the civil rights movement is starting to expand and take its various forms, you still have ongoing white terroristic violence. right? So it takes the form of the Klan or any other white supremacist group, or it could just be honestly the state as well, certain police precincts attacking and terrorizing Black communities. And so as a response, you had a lot of Black former veterans of, let's say World War II, or other battles come home after fighting fascism abroad and coming home and using those skills to defend their communities, but also to defend civil rights activists who may not be armed or who may be who may take a commitment to nonviolent methods, right, or taking nonviolence as a philosophy, right. So for every march that you see during the civil rights movement, more than likely there were deacons of defense circulating or in the area ready to protect and defend those folks. And so, yeah, moving through the time period, this is when you start to see, of course, the rise of Black Power movements through into the 60s. Of course, you're going to see things such as the Black Panther Party for Self-Defense, who got their inspiration in part from the Lowndes County Black Panther Party in Lowndes County, Alabama, which it's important to know ancestors such as Kwame Ture, who was formerly known as Stokely Carmichael, who organized with folks who, as they were trying to fight for the right, for Black people's right to vote, they had to carry pistols, not because it was just something to carry or a matter of machismo, but it was a matter of survival. They were being actively attacked, right? And so, again, this current theme that we're seeing across time is that Black people are using firearms as one tool of many, as a means to protect themselves and to ensure that we're able to at least push certain reforms or radical shifts in this country and elsewhere as well to survive, right? This isn't a matter of wanting to own something, this tool, this dangerous tool for the sake of having the tool, is to survive, right? Another text that I want to bring up is We Will Shoot Back by Dr. Ukinyele Moja. And this is a text talking about the armed resistance that occurred in the Mississippi Freedom Movement, right? So when you look at places such as Jackson, Mississippi, and other surrounding areas, there's an entire history, complicated history, part of which included actively struggling against white terroristic violence as Black people organized to uplift their communities. And so, yeah, I think, and then from there, this is when you get sort of like going up into the modern era, various gun clubs that arise for different reasons, of course, and, have varying ideologies, but many of which are tied to the fact that it's important for Black people to understand how firearms work, because we need to keep our community safe from various threats.
Thank you so much for that history. That is incredible. I'm so glad we're recording this conversation so I can go back and take more thorough notes. But just for our listeners, I did write down every book that you recommended, and we'll be sure to post that in the description of the video so that folks can check out those reading recommendations. So one thing that kind of struck me when you were talking through the history, and you kind of also touched on this at the end, that like firearms have always been a part of like a kind of wide range of tools for the like community and self-defense. And also, like, the restriction of firearms has been one of many tools that the state has used to oppress Black people and folks in the labor movement, et cetera. And I was wondering if you could maybe share a little bit more on that as we think. Obviously, we'll get into some more tomorrow, yeah. But like explicitly the Black codes, and those weren't just about firearms. That was obviously part of it, but that there were also other pieces, and how maybe we're seeing some of those echoed today, like how we're restricting the ability for people to learn this history that you're sharing. It's not lost on me that many people, this will be the only place they'll be able to hear this kind of history if they're students and might not be able to access that information in their classroom or things like that. I don't know if you have kind of thoughts about that.
Yeah, no, I think it's really important to note that, especially as we approach this special session in Tennessee, in the South, during this moment where we're seeing various forms of fascist violence in particular. Yeah, historically, the gun restriction, and I want to expand the conversation because the country by design is anti-black, and so regardless of how things shift, even in this instance of firearm usage, like it can and will be used in an anti-black manner. But particularly as it relates to gun control, yes, there's very much so a very racist anti-black history associated with gun control. Again, like as you said, I mentioned the black codes following the post Civil War era, the Reconstruction era, and the Native period. You see these regulations that were put upon black people, particularly in the U.S. South, that restricted black people from having the ability to own a firearm. And so you get efforts to disarm black people, which is not just about taking away black people's ability to own a gun, but it's about taking away black people's tools to fight back against systemic oppression and just the legacy of chattel slavery and colonialism, right, in the States. And so, again, like, and firearm laws have shifted in different states across the country over time for different reasons, a lot of which has to do with their response to black people. One thing to particularly note is in the 60s when you have the Black Panthers who famously, armed up and walked into the California state capitol as a means to test the limits and show the double standards associated with relaxed firearm laws. Following that, you not too long after that, you get something like the Mulford Act, which the NRA supported, right? We're talking about the same NRA that is pro-gun and everything. And you also get a certain president who was there at the time, Ronald Reagan, who backed these restrictive gun control measures. That begins the process of California being as restrictive as it is now. So again, we're talking about a very, very much so restrictive history. Typically when we think of California, they're like, oh, they're a liberal state and they're restrictive. This is why they have guns. But again, that has a very anti-black history behind that, right? I think I think that, and I have to do some digging, but even when you look at certain areas that are restrictive, again, it's very complex. It's not reducible to one particular factor, but you can certainly find in certain places, especially if they have histories of militant resistance or particularly of black people or even other marginalized people, you're likely to find a correlation between restrictive firearm measures and that, right? I think where this conversation gets entangled is when we also talk about the various forms of violence on the streets and interpersonally that's associated with firearms or just criminal behavior as well. The problem is that one of the things that you see, and it's not a coincidence, following the 70s, following the fall of the Panthers, you start to see this association of armed resistance move away from more radical organizations such as Black Panther Party, and you start to see this messaging that is very conservative messaging and racialized messaging that associates that more so with criminality, with certain racist tropes around black people and non-white people. And the only time you see it associated in a sort of quote unquote non-criminal light is when you start to see these images that we are familiar with of gun-toting white men, typically Southern, who are defending their rights, right? And so I think that's important to note because in so many ways the methods of armed struggle or use of self-defense in movement struggle in so many ways from a mainstream discourse has been detached historically, and which very much shapes our current conversations around firearms, right? And so this is part of the reason why when you have these conversations around firearms, these types of histories don't come up because it's been actively erased. I mean, even in this moment in real time, such that it becomes this very binary and, to be honest, very white conversation where it's sort of like we're talking about the obsessive white conservative who is interested in maintaining their right to own a firearm by any means, or the suburban white liberal who doesn't want anything to do with guns, doesn't thinks it's all bad, it should all go away magically, and only police and military should have guns. And what's erased in that conversation are marginalized populations who have a very different relationship to firearms, who understand that that has been a tool. Even though it's also been used in a way that is destroying our communities, it's also been a tool of liberation and a tool for pushing certain radical reforms and other victories. And so I think when we reinsert that into the conversation, a lot of our orientation around firearms policy becomes different. And so then it becomes less so about the firearms and more about the politics and the larger systemic problems that lead to certain incidences of gun violence. So whether we're talking about white supremacy, whether we're talking about cultural, like patriarchal norms associated with guns, like how guns are often associated with people's notions of masculinity, right? Or if we're talking about how a lot of violence is shaped by depravity or impoverished conditions, right? Or that's offset by communities being economically exploited, then the conversation becomes larger. Because then it becomes less about, oh, let's think about this thing, this tool that is dangerous, that can cause destruction, no denial about that. But then we start to think more comprehensively around the root of that violence. And then as a result, a lot of our public policy demands become more comprehensive, right? And I know we'll talk about this a little bit more tomorrow, hence the title. But like, I really think it's important that people who understand, at least on the surface level, the devastation that gun violence causes, to think about that, to continue to think about that logic on a larger scale. So if you're thinking about gun violence in your community, if you're not okay with that in close proximity to you, are you okay with that when it's not in your state, when it's not in the country, when the gun violence is being wielded by the military, right? Or even if you're at home, if you're not okay with interpersonal violence and gun violence at home amongst people who have gotten into a conflict, why are we then okay with that when it comes from police? Right. And so it's one of these things where when we bring in this history, we start to connect certain conversations that mainstream discourse refuses to connect. So when we talk about gun violence, we include police violence, we include military violence, we include a lot of other things. Right. And so as a result, some of our responses are going to be a lot more comprehensive.
Yeah, thank you for highlighting that, because and just by way of example, maybe one of the things that we've kind of thought about at Healthy and Free, because a lot of the folks that are involved in Healthy and Free kind of came out of the anti-violence movement, right? And we do know that Tennessee in particular struggles with firearms related deaths as a form of domestic violence, and really kind of have thought about this and in like a critical way. How do we like hold that reality that is like a violent thing, but that the root of that violence isn't necessarily the firearm, that we're talking about like patriarchy and racism and ableism and misogyny that are really what is causing a high mortality rate. And it's not to say that we can ignore in domestic violence situations. It's just to provide an example for folks who might be watching and saying like, I too want to provide a critical lens to my thoughts on gun policy, like how you might start to have those conversations and think about these things that, like, when we had that conversation, we were like, okay, we need to think about, you know, what are some alternatives we can provide folks who don't feel comfortable, or for whatever reason, calling the police, that's in alignment with our abolitionist values, that support people in getting safety and the housing and the economic security they need to escape violence, and also that cause violence, right?
Yeah.
Like that we know the stress of those economic pressures cause violence in the home and things like that. So thank you so much for highlighting that, and just wanted
Yeah.
to provide an example. And I guess, like, I know we're kind of getting close to time, but one thing that also kind of struck me when you were talking about these pieces is that maybe there's like this, and correct me if I'm wrong, but potentially there's like an appropriation of this history that we've talked about
Yeah.
among like white or whoever we think of when we think of gun owners, the people who are wearing the, you know, full out military gear with the big rifles, white, conservative, Southern, walking around, want to talk about it, that there's this like message around like the government wants to take our guns, and how that is really an appropriation of all the history that you've described here, that Black people and brown people and marginalized populations, folks involved in the labor movement, have experienced for years. And wondering if you could share a little bit more about that, maybe.
No, no, absolutely. I actually really appreciate this question, because like what you're getting at is something that hasn't, at least from my experience, has not been named in some spaces explicitly. So, um, you know, folks like us in our circles are very familiar, very aware of the growing right-wing fascist front that is growing throughout the states, but especially in the South, right? People refer to it as a neo-Confederacy and things of that sort. And so one of the things that's very eye-opening about this sort of growing front, this sort of fascist tide that's happening, is that it's it's becoming more and more multifaceted, right? And it's very uncomfortable to name, but it's multiracial, and it holds multiple identities, right? So we're seeing a lot of these countercultural messages in response to some of the pushes in the last 10 plus years of left organizing, right? That looks like these doubling down on gender norms. It looks like, including as it relates to firearms, right-wing organizations, entities, influencers, people, especially in the Second Amendment community, selectively picking parts of marginalized armed resistance history, such as Black people, for example, and doing a thing where they focus on, hey, Black people should carry guns too when it's convenient and it doesn't threaten us. See, look at the Panthers. They carried guns. While completely disregarding their revolutionary politics, completely disregarding their programs, their survival programs, the context under which they were organizing, why they were organizing, and the reality that they were organizing against people who shared these conservative politics that are appropriating their history and erasing their history, right? And unfortunately, again, we have a lot of influencers even in Black Second Amendment communities that are pushing this revisionist narrative, or this truncated narrative, I would like to say. So it's very much so a problem. It's very much so a problem. I think that it's fascism doubling down on itself. It's the empire doubling down on itself. Like, it's, as things are crumbling, as things are becoming more and more intense, we're starting to see this sort of uptick in violence, uptick in violence that is grounded in a lot of these systems that we talked about. Very much so patriarchal, very much so grounded in white ideas of white supremacy or hegemony, very much so ableist, and very much so destructive of the environment, right? And so I think it's important to name to people who are watching this that it's vital for us to look at the entirety of the histories that involved armed struggle. Why exactly were people choosing to use this tool? And what did it allow for, right? What were the goals, and how does that shape current conditions, right? Because I think when we do that, I think we create a different orientation around firearms that isn't so overly simplistic or that falls into this sort of like neoliberal conservative or neoliberal and fascist dynamic or binary that leaves us without this critical lens, right? And again, I would also ask people, especially as relates to your previous question, to think more critically when we think about these complex realities. So using the examples of domestic violence and the reality that firearms play a huge role in that, what is it in shaping a solution? What are the needs? What are the material needs of the people that are in danger, right? What do, in this case, it's predominantly women, what do women need in those instances? They need shelters. They need easy avenues for economic support to where they can move away from their abusers. They need communities that are able to support them. And so when we think about those more comprehensive measures, in addition to direct responses to firearm ownership, right? Because we have to address that. I think we can be a little bit more surgical and a little bit more precise than sort of waving this wand and just say everything has to go without consideration about how that may impact different communities based on different situations, such as, organizing for larger structural changes.
Absolutely. Well, I feel like we might have to end it there because that was pretty amazing. Set us up too for tomorrow about like why we kind of wanted to spend a whole section talking about this historical context so that we can have these informed conversations about folks' material needs. So thank you again so much for your time, for your wisdom. We are so excited to continue this conversation tomorrow. As I said earlier, I'll be sure to drop the titles of the books that you recommended for folks in the description of the video, as well as making sure that if folks have questions or comments or things, we definitely want you to post them in the comments so that we can get to them tomorrow too, because I think we've done a really great job, and we kind of hinted at it at the end, really great job setting up a lot of the problems, a lot of the complex history, and I'm excited to get into some solutions with you. So this sounds awesome. Well, any last words or anything that we?
Yeah, no, thank you. I would just encourage people to look into, especially as we're having this conversation and battle over what's being taught in schools or what's being allowed to be discussed in popular discourse, especially here in the South. I would definitely challenge people to look into these histories, right, that go beyond memes, that go beyond, social media conversations. I would actually challenge folks to really read if possible, or to find some reliable resources on these histories of armed struggle, both in the U.S. and abroad, because these things are connected. That we don't live in a vacuum, and so definitely want people to study those things and use that to inform your decisions about current conversations.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much, and we'll see y'all tomorrow.
All right. Thank y'all. See y'all tomorrow.